Welcome to Kent ISD Literacy Leaders and Coaches Network Remote Edition. We're excited to bring you our 9th episode of the LLCN Brief. We appreciate those that are now following us on your preferred podcast outlet and excited to share that we now have about 1,200 plus unique listens to our previous 8 podcast episodes. These listens come from 16 different countries and 35 different states. We appreciate that you are finding value in the information we are making available for you. Thank you for continuing to share your message with those that you know will benefit from listening.
Our LLCN participants have always valued the networking opportunities of our offerings. This year, in our podcast, we've added the opportunity to reflect upon and dialogue about our topics through scheduled Twitter chats. 2 weeks after each new podcast launch, we connect with listeners via an hour-long evening Twitter chat to further process the topic and learning. I'm Sarah Shoemaker, Early Literacy Coach at Kent Intermediate School District. Joining me today is my colleague Mark.
I'm Mark Raffler. I'm the ELA and Social Studies Educational Consultant here at Kent Intermediate School District. The topics of reading, writing, speaking, and listening have all been heavily involved in education conversations. The topic of writing, however, always has been filled with many questions from teachers and school improvement teams. While we would, of course, always like to improve reading scores, the writing performance of students certainly seems to be one that deserves an equal amount, if not more, attention. With acknowledgement to the importance of writing, why is it that it is so challenging to get students writing the way we hope it will be?
In this podcast episode, we will be spending some time learning about writing instruction. Today, our guest from Arizona State University, Dr. Steve Graham, author, researcher, and professor of writing and instruction for over 42 years, joins the podcast to assist us in exploring the topic of writing.
Joining us today is Dr. Steve Graham. He is a Regent and Warner Professor in the Division of Leadership and Innovation in Teachers College. For 42 years, he has studied how writing develops, to teach it effectively, and how writing can be used to support reading and learning. In recent years, he has been involved in the development and testing of digital tools for supporting writing and reading through a series of grants from the Institute of Educational Sciences and the Office of Special Education Programs in the United States Department of Education. His research involves typically developing writers and students with special needs in both elementary and secondary schools, with much occurring in classrooms in urban schools. Thanks for being with us today, Dr. Steve Graham.
Thank you so much, Mark. I'm really glad to be here.
As an author, researcher, and professor of writing, Dr. Graham, what is the first thing you tell educators in the field about writing instruction?
Well, I often lead with something that I don't actually know that's 100% true. I tell administrators and teachers that they need to double how much time students spend writing. Now, the reason I don't say that that's 100% accurate is that what we know is that there's not a lot of writing going on in classrooms across the US, also just generally across the world. We do know that if we increase how much students write by about 45 minutes a week, which is only 15 minutes, 3 days a week, we get a positive effect in terms of the overall quality of their writing and also a generalization effect to their reading comprehension. So you get a twofer out of that. Now, that's not saying that 45 minutes a week is enough. What we recommend is that students spend an hour each day writing and being taught to write. And that wouldn't include any writing that was done at home, but in the school setting. Although that can cut across any content area classroom as well.
Dr. Graham, I think we read about those positive impacts when we increase writing in your article titled A Better Path to Writing, Evidence-Based Practices in the Classroom. The percentage points were actually astounding. A 12 percentile point in writing quality and a 14 percentile point in measures of reading comprehension. What do teachers say when they hear this or see this in their students?
Well, they're often a little bit surprised. And, I'd add to that We've also taken a look at what happens when you use writing as a tool to support students' learning. So, content learning, you get a slightly similar, or in some cases, slightly larger impact, in that 12 to 15 percentile range in terms of students understanding material that they're learning, and also in terms of their remembrance of that. I think one of the things to kind of keep in mind about writing is thinking. So if you're writing about something that you read, that means you have to make decisions when you put it onto text about what's most important, because you're not going to write out everything. You have to make decisions about how to take that information and organize it, like when you write a summary. But even note taking requires organizing information. You put that information in your own words. And so when you put information in your own words, it means two things. One, you're personalizing it and handling it. And we know that when you handle information, it makes it more understandable. And second, you're rehearsing it. You're getting a second chance of taking a look at that information. Now, when you write it out, it gives you a chance also to take a look back and see if your understanding was adequate. Not everybody does this, but because writing is a more permanent kind of thing, you can look and see, oh, yeah, I agree with what I wrote here, or I didn't, or I got it right, or I didn't get it right. So there's a lot of ways in which writing helps you understand what you read. And likewise, when you use writing as a tool for supporting content learning, it helps you in that way. I think another thing that I'd like to say here is that, probably one way of thinking about writing with kids is that we can use writing in a way that they don't think that they're writing per se. They're working on an activity and it involves writing. So writing doesn't have to be the primary purpose. It's one of the tools that we use to help us accomplish some particular goal. So if you look at kids writing at home now, they're writing all the time, social media and other places, but they don't think of it as writing. Now, they typically do think of things as writing when they're doing this at school, but it doesn't always have to be in that vein. Writing can be a byproduct or, in a sense, an end product of something that we're trying to accomplish, whether it's for learning or for some other goals that students set or teachers and students set together.
So really a reciprocal relationship with the writing and the reading and understanding and thinking about how those tools can work together rather than to create a necessary end product that feels daunting to students, but to incorporate all of this heavier thinking and decision making and organizing in a way that students see a purpose or an activity.
That's correct. And let me give a kind of a practical example of this. And I'm going to pull this from my daughter's schooling. When she was in fifth grade, we lived in Washington, D.C. And if you live anywhere near the Chesapeake Bay, uh, Virginia, DC, Maryland, or Delaware, at some point as a kid, you're going to save the Chesapeake Bay. It's kind of a rite of passage in school. And she went to a Quaker school there, and they had a stream that ran behind the school and also ran behind the University of Maryland. Now, this sounds like it's a long way from the bay, so to speak, but their idea was is that they would clean up that stream and try to keep it clean so that the water running from it into the bay wouldn't pollute. Now, this doesn't sound like it has a thing to do with writing, right? So when you took a look at what they did over the course of this unit that they worked on, they wrote two letters that went to College Park, University of Maryland's College Park newspaper that were published. They wrote one that was published in the College Park newsletter that went out weekly. They wrote two letters to the Washington Post. Neither were published, but they were engaged in it. They wrote two grants that they submitted, one to the university, one to the college, at College Park municipal organization. They held a rally where they created signs and wrote on those. They wrote letters that they put in every mailbox in the neighborhood in which the school was situated. Now, if you'd have asked them, are you writing? They would not have thought of it in that way. They were thinking they were doing something that was important to them, and writing was a byproduct of that. And I have to say, it was very interesting watching this because the teacher basically, helped set up the parameters around this and then stepped aside, and the kids jumped into it and they were full bore on this. They were going, at this, with the passion that you would hope occurs in any kind of learning. But writing was a central part of that, and obviously reading was too, because to write the grant and do the other kinds of things they did, they had to read quite a bit about how pollution from small streams eventually end up in the Chesapeake Bay and what that means in terms of wildlife and keeping that estuary alive. So I think it's one of the better examples I've ever seen of doing something that involves writing for a real purpose in a school setting.
It's amazing when we um, have kids that are curious and dedicated and passionate and convicted about something, and that their advocacy can take them into academic realms that they might turn their nose to at any other given point, but that they want to share the research and the story through the writing and the letters in the mailbox and things like that. Thank you for sharing, Dr. Graham.
You bet.
So you mentioned the teaching of writing, where the kids might not necessarily even realize they're writing. Appreciate that aspect. We are frequently asked questions around writing instruction, and those questions include: how long should students write each day? Should we dictate topics or allow student choice when thinking about writing? Where should we start with writing genre? Talk to us about the guidance you'd offer teachers in these areas.
So, one of the things that I'd like to say is that when I think about writing, I think of five things, and we've talked about one of them already, but I can cull these down in a way that students need to write. They need to write in the classroom, they need to write across the curriculum, and they need to write as a tool to help them understand what they're reading. At a minimum, I'd recommend that occurs at least 30 minutes a day. Could occur more, but a minimum of 30 minutes a day across the curriculum. In addition to that, when students write, we need to support them as they're engaged in the process of writing. And there's a lot of things that we can do that have evidence that suggests that they're effective. One, we can be very clear about the goals that we're setting. I'll come back to choice in a minute, but if we ask students to write something for us, the clearer we are about what we expect, the more likely we are to end up with that in terms of students writing. Actually, for the amount of time it takes, that's probably the most effective thing we could do on a time basis. We want to be sure that we use tools that support writers. So, things like word processing, and as we're moving to word processors with additional capabilities, that has a positive effect on students' writing. There's no doubt about it. And one of the things that's important, though, is that students learn to type at least fast enough when they're using word processing so it's not a bottleneck in terms of their producing text. We don't know exactly what that speed is, but if I was to take a guess, about 20 words per minute would be my guess. We want to use things like graphic organizers that help kids generate ideas and organize them. We want to help students learn how to locate information to use in their own writing, to look at source material. We want to provide students with feedback. All of these are things that we provide as support as they write in terms of the types of structure and information we share before writing, during writing, and after writing with them. We also want to be sure that we teach students the skills, processes, knowledge, and help them acquire the motivational beliefs that will support them as writers. So, I could kind of boil it down to three things out of the five at this point: write, support, and teach. Now, there's a lot we could teach here. So we have to be, thoughtful in terms of what we focus on because we have a limited amount of time for doing this. But one thing is very clear for young kids, kindergarten through about third grade, and for some kids beyond this, they need to master basic transcription skills. We want those to become automatic. We don't want them to think about whether it's typing or handwriting. That should be automatic, reasonably legible, and fluent. And this doesn't take a lot of time to master for most kids. We want them to start being able to spell most of the words that they use in their writing without having to think about that. Now, that usually extends beyond third grade. We also want students to start mastering processes involving planning. I mean, this can start as early as kindergarten with things like brainstorming, drafting, revising, and editing their text. So we want to be sure they have the skills that, you know, let them get text or transcribe text onto paper, but we also want to be sure that they have the skills that help them get their ideas out there in terms of planning and for them to revise and change those ideas as they go. We also want to help them become more facile. And notice I didn't say automatic here with sentence construction. Sentence construction involves thinking, but we want kids to be able to do this without stumbling all over the sentences themselves. Now, that takes time. That doesn't develop overnight. That should be one of our goals all the way through schooling. In addition, we want to be sure that they know the purposes of different types of writing and how writing is structured together. You know, what you were talking about is genre. My own personal opinion is that it works better if you focus in on a genre as a unit, where you're writing multiple, like if it's a genre on persuasive writing, then you're exploring the use of persuasive writing and you're writing multiple pieces that involves persuasion within the context of that unit. And that would mean things like, having a good look at what constitutes a strong persuasive text, generating that knowledge and a good piece of writing, generating your own text that you use to convince others, including using genre elements, like what's your topic sentence? What is it that your premise here that you want to say? What kind of reasons are you going to put forward? Will your reader buy those? How are you going to explain those, provide evidence for them? Those aspects of genre students need to know that's what a persuasive essay involves. Also dealing with the other side of the argument. In addition, there's a host of beliefs that students bring to the writing process that can either enhance or impede their approach to writing. So, one I'll just say that I think is particularly powerful is your confidence in your ability to write. And so, if we set up our learning task in ways that students are successful in writing, and we make sure that they see that success, and that can be very visual, like, in a graph showing, that they've included all those elements I was talking about before in their persuasive text. And we talk with them about how they did that using the strategies that they learned and effort, then we increase the chances that they're going to be more confident writers, which has a very positive relationship with how students grow and develop as writers over time. Now, obviously, there's other things like your attitudes towards writing, whether you write for intrinsic reasons or extrinsic reasons. Intrinsic being, I write because I'm curious about a topic. I write because I want to become involved in it. We really want to do as much as we can to promote that kind of writing in the classroom and beyond. So in terms of the writing part, what we teach, we want to be smart and not try to cover everything because we don't have time, but we definitely want to make sure students master and automatize transcription skills. They become facile in terms of sentence construction, and they learn the strategies they need within genres to plan, produce, revise, edit, and share the text they're creating. In addition, we want to basically create. I said initially I was going to go with 5. I'm going to go with 4. So I'm going to go with the write, support, teach, and connect. We want to set up writing communities in which kids can flourish, where they feel free to take a chance. So if we give them something to write, then we want them to have some choice in the sense of modifying that assignment when appropriate. It's not always appropriate so that it meets their interests, but that means taking a chance on the part of students. We want to have a writing community in which students support each other. So things like peer revising, peer planning together, even peer drafting are very important. We want to expect that, we want to encourage students. We want to set challenging goals that students can meet, but we want to encourage them to do their best. In a sense, I think of this as pushing out the envelope a little bit. You don't want to push that envelope out too far, but you want to push them to do a little bit better every time. And we want to give feedback that is positive and constructive in nature. And I want to say something specifically about feedback, and then I'll come to choice as my final thing here. One of the things, if you're an English teacher, we feel like we have to give feedback on everything. And I'm just going to share a story here. When I was in college, I had a disastrous semester where I had a F in I flunked French, and I lived 6.5 years in France, so that's really hard to explain. And I got a D in a composition studies course. And so you might say, why is he interested in writing? But I remember the paper, the major paper in that course. It looked like it had been in Psycho, where you have that shower scene and the knife coming through. It had bled to death on every page. I never looked at it. I burned it in my backyard along with the French book. Probably not a very mature response, to that situation. But it's always stuck with me that we want to be smart about feedback. We don't want to give too much. It's overwhelming for developing writers. I was an adult and I found it overwhelming. And we want to be sure that we point out the things that we particularly like about what kids do, because that increases the chances that we'll see that again. We want to be sure that our feedback is constructive, but in the best sense, it's not telling students exactly what to do. It's getting them to ask questions of their own writing so that we don't take that ownership out of their hands. It stays in their hands. Now, the question about choice is a complicated one. There's probably about 15 studies looking at choice in writing that we've been able to locate. Only 3 of them, maybe 4, have positive effects. So if you were looking at the research literature, you'd be hard pressed to say that providing choice is going to, in and of itself, improve how students write. On the other hand, with that said, everybody likes choice. It may not give you the jump or boost in overall writing quality by doing it once or twice. But if you think about what I said about creating a classroom where people can flourish, if you don't have choice and it's so autocratic that students can't make kind of personal decisions on their own writing and also have opportunities to choose writing, then in that sense, we've created a situation where I don't think most students, are going to see writing as something they want to continue to do over time. And I'll share one last story here. One of my favorite stories is about a famous writer who was part of a group in New York that met in a bar once a week to talk about their writing. And one of his stories was about when he was at Cambridge in England, that he was given a paper to write for a final exam that was about the US and British Trades Fishery Act. Now, that's a pretty dry kind of topic. Now, what I loved was he put his own choice in there. He wrote about it from the point of view of the fish. So he got all the aspects of what had to happen in terms of his assignment, but he had a little bit of fun with it. And, I have no idea what kind of grade he got about it on it, but I love that is that, he personalized it, he made it his own. My guess is it was a lot more fun to read on the part of the instructor than if it had been just straight up about the U.S. fisheries acts between U.S. and Britain.
Yeah, I appreciate as you've been sharing the information and answering. I do appreciate the stories and things to help create context for us. And you really hit on there those 4 pieces of write, support, teach, and connect. But I also like that you built in key concepts, and I think the things that really stood out to me was your emphasis around clarity, your emphasis on focusing on the time, and then your emphasis, and these kind of fit together, but building confidence, but then also that idea of feedback and it being positive, right? So I think that positive and constructive feedback helps build into the confidence as well as, right, the clarity. Like we want to set these kids up for success, and the best way to do it, as you ended there, was around choice. And so whether or not choice maybe is something that's so open-ended, like we might perceive it to be, as you suggested, on occasion, there's no harm in necessarily giving topics or guidance around a topic, but that if students come with something that's of choice, of an angle or a way they want to approach it, that we're open to that and see it and see a vision of how it might be, maybe different than maybe how we envisioned it to be in the first place. So good ideas to help us really expand the teachers that we're working with in their thinking as they look at teaching writing in their classrooms.
So I'd like to add something about choice here. When I said it was complex before, we have a fairly large literature on choice in psychology in general. And one of the things that's can be particularly important with choice is that sometimes we think of choice as open-ended. And for some kids, that is, I'll give a really practical example. I'll go back to my daughter in first grade. She didn't like to write. Her handwriting was really slow. She had trouble spelling, one out of every two words. So she would avoid writing whenever she could. And she was in a class that basically allowed you to choose. Every topic was chosen, and it was open ended. And so she could spend 3 or 4 days picking a topic. And if you ask her why, she was really clear. I don't want to write. I don't like to write. I'm putting it off. She wouldn't say it in the same words I'm saying it, but that's exactly what was happening. And so finally, the teacher decided that enough's enough. And so she gave Leah a choice. You have three things to choose from. You have a particular time frame in which you need to do this. And so that was very helpful in that case. And so, when we think about choice, it doesn't have to be open ended, it can be participatory, where the teacher helps structure that choice activity. And for some kids, that's very, very important. My daughter gamed the system, and, teacher finally realized it and she found a way to kind of get around it. I think it's important to keep in mind with anything that I say here, depending upon your classroom, your students, you always want to make sure that it fits within the context in which it's applied. So I don't talk about things that are not evidence based, but I'm also smart enough to realize at this point, you just can't take something exactly as it worked in a research study and plop it down in a class, say in South Carolina, because the situation is going to be a little bit different and teachers need to adjust that to their students and to their situation. I think that's particularly important.
Yeah, I thanks for that follow up to that, because that will always be something that we fall back on, right? We use words and we use terminology and we use studies. And so to circle back to that and explain that, I like the analogy. Here's a study. Yes, it's a study. Yes, it's evidence based, but will that just go as it is and drop in and work for the kid, the teacher? We have to be a little bit flexible within that and stay within those reins and provide that guided choice or that structured choice.
Yeah, I agree 100%. If we want teachers to use evidence based practices, I think that's the only way it's going to work. Teachers need to be able, just like I say in writing, kids need to be able to know that this writing is their writing. They have ownership of it. Whatever teachers implement in their class, they have to feel that they have ownership of it, or they're not going to implement it. You know, it's not going to be there. And you often see this in research studies. Researchers go in, they work with teachers, and it can be a two-way street. But after they're gone, sometimes it stays in place. More often than not, it's gone. And there's a lot of reasons for that. There's constantly this kind of new introduction within schools of new ideas and new materials, et cetera. So there's always kind of this push to change. But if teacher doesn't buy in, if teachers don't see it as their own in some way, I don't think they're likely to use it. And in the long run, we know quite a bit about teaching literacy to kids. We just don't always see it put into play in classrooms. So I think we need to do a better job of helping teachers see this as, this is theirs. It's not ours. It's not academia's. It's theirs to implement, theirs to change as they see the need to.
Yeah, great. And throwing the ownership piece in there too. Again, thank you.
Dr. Graham, we mentioned early in the podcast that we had recently read and reread your article, A Path to Better Writing Evidence Based Practices in the Classroom, and talked a little bit about the research that comes out in that article that identifies that writing impacts reading comprehension. Will you talk to us a bit more about the relationship between the two?
Yeah, I'd be glad to do that. I think there's three ways of thinking about the relationship between writing and reading, or writing and reading connections. One is to think about this as writing and reading share a pool of common knowledge. Okay, so, and you can think about this on multiple levels. So, one level would be, kind of the background knowledge, the knowledge that you have about what you're going to write, or the knowledge about what you have about what you're going to read that resides in you. But you have this pool of knowledge when both you read and write, you draw upon. And, an analogy that sometimes has been used is that you have these two buckets. One is writing, one is reading. You have a well, and you have this well of knowledge. And so that can be extended in other ways as well. So if you think about word level knowledge, something like spelling and the coding of words, well, that's drawing on the same knowledge about the orthography and phonology of English language, or if it's in a different language, it would be the same kind of thing. But basically, if you know how to decode words and you learn skills for decoding, many of those skills can be learned used for spelling and vice versa. So that's another place, this kind of knowledge that we have about decoding and spelling and the overlaps between the two in terms of how orthography and phonology are related, or the alphabet principle, if you'd like. Another kind of example of this kind of shared knowledge viewpoint is, you have knowledge about the purposes of writing, like writing a persuasive text or writing a story, and how stories, for example, are connected. So if I know that stories usually have a protagonist, they happen in a certain place and sometimes in a certain time that's identifiable, and usually something happens to affect the protagonist, and they have goals, even if they're not stated, they have something that they're trying to achieve, and they set out, and there's action related to it, and either the goal gets resolved or it doesn't, and the action keeps moving forward to some kind of end. And at some point, everybody's going to have a reaction. They're going to be happy, sad, mad, etc. But these elements are really common, and if you know them when you read, basically you tie information together. It helps you understand. But by the same token, when you write, those elements help you create something, a story that other people will understand. Pick other areas like vocabulary being an example, or how sentences are put together. Your knowledge of syntax and semantics, you draw on those wells. So the basic idea there is that if I teach a kid to read, then some of that knowledge is likely to be generalizable to writing. If I teach a kid to write, then some of that knowledge is going to be generalizable to reading. And the evidence supports that. Okay. It's not enough to say, oh, all I got to do is teach reading, and I'm going to have good writers, or all I have to do is teach writing, and I'm going to have good readers. That's pretty evident. It used to be that we taught more people to read than we did to write. And you can read without writing, learning to write, but you can't write without learning to read. So writing may actually give a little bit more back to reading on this. Another way of thinking about this is that it's called the rhetorical relations viewpoint. It's just two large words for a simple construct. Reading and writing are about communication. So when you read, if we're paying attention in particular ways, we might think about, what was the author trying to do here? Why did they use that particular set of words? When we get to a cliffhanger at the end, we might think about what comes next. But in a sense, we're engaging in a communication act with the author. By the same token, when we write, under the best of circumstances, and we have an audience that we're thinking, that we're writing for, we're thinking about what that audience needs to be able to understand what we're doing. And so that kind of crosstalk between author and reader, and author and eventual reader on both the reading and writing side, are ways in which students gain information that help them become more savvy about both reading and writing. And then there's a third way of thinking about this, and it's a functional way, basically, is that we use reading and writing as tools for accomplishing particular goals, and one of those is learning. So when we read a text, say about Frederick Douglass, as an example, and then we write about how Frederick Douglass, if we're a kid, his life as a teenager was similar or different from ours, then what we're doing is we're using both of those in conjunction as a way of increasing that pool of knowledge. Remember the well that we started with, that we have about Frederick Douglass, which not only makes us more familiar with Frederick Douglass and his goals and his aims in his life, but it also provides us fodder, in a sense, for writing and reading about Frederick Douglass and understanding his life better in the future. When we talk about these connections, reading and writing, honestly, we also have to bring in learning and understanding. But that's the way that I would see these three as operating together in terms of thinking about it. Shared knowledge, communication acts between the two or informing each other, and a functional use where we use them together for particularly purposes in the case of school learning.
Dr. Graham, wow. Like, it's obvious that your time and dedication to this subject is your passion in the way that you give us so much information about the purpose of writing and why writing is important. And I just go back to my notes as you're talking and think about all of the things that resonate with me and just where do I even start to pull things out? But you said you can't write without learning to read. And I started to understand how that story just weaves into the purpose not only of academic learning but the communication, right, that we have on a day-to-day basis, that we're encouraging kids to use these not as end goals in our classroom but as the way that they're communicating their thoughts and ideas and their passions out to the world. And so when you summarize it so nicely about their well of knowledge and then their communication venues basically and the functional use in their time as a student, it just brought it all together for me. So thank you for sharing that today.
Well, thank you. I'm glad it was clear.
I have to agree with Sarah. The answer to the last question was fantastic and really has me thinking in a million different directions. But hoping to continue to get these great responses and next steps, our next question takes us to this idea of assessment. So, how do we assess writing skills to capture where students' abilities are and then, more importantly, communicate this information back to the students for reflection and improvement in their writing?
So I'm going to approach your question in a slightly different way. I tend to like to talk about assessment from a formative point of view and a summative point of view. And I'm going to focus mostly on formative. And I'd like to bring us back to what I said at the beginning of this interview that I sometimes say to administrators and teachers they need to double the amount of writing that they do in the classroom. And I can tell you immediately there's pushback, and it's not from the teachers per se, but they are reflecting what they fear is their teachers' concerns. And they say, well, there's not enough time to give feedback if we double the amount of time that students write. And so, one form of assessment that's particular to writing is feedback on a product you produce. Now, that doesn't mean that it's only in writing, but it is definitely particular to writing. And in terms of doing that, we know a couple of things in relationship to this pushback by principals. One is that, and I mentioned this earlier, is that if you give feedback on everything, then you can spend an inordinate amount of time. Think about a high school teacher with, 5 classes, 30 kids each. You can see where that's overwhelming. You're just not going to have as many writing assignments. But I think one of the things that's important to keep in mind is that there are multiple sources for obtaining feedback. And there are some things that we don't need to give feedback on. So, for example, and we'll start with that, let's say that I'm using writing as a tool for learning in my classroom. I'm having students before a science experiment write what their hypotheses are and why. Well, I don't really need to give feedback on that writing, right? That's serving a purpose for thinking about this experiment. I don't care if it's in perfect English or not. It doesn't matter to me if I'm doing that. So I think it's important to keep in mind that there's some writing that maybe we don't have to give feedback on. The second thing is we're not the only sources of feedback in the classroom. Now, this takes a little bit of work, but peers have been pretty successful in giving feedback to each other when we set up a structure within which to do that. And the structure can be set up in such a way that it's flexible. So, for example, some work that we've done we always stress that when you give feedback, and there's nothing, particularly great about the number three, but we seem to use it an awful lot. Let the author know three things that you liked about what you just read. So up front, we want something positive. And then in some instances, what we've done is we've said, there's two things that we want you to give feedback on. So let's say it's a group of younger kids, so they may not produce as much writing. And so any place that you see where you think, a little more information would have been helpful, put a caret. In any place that you don't understand what was there, put a question mark. And then what we do is we work with them, basically model, they practice a conversation with the writer. What I liked, I didn't quite understand this part here, where you have the question mark, or can you tell me more about this? With the idea that it's a conversation between the listener and the writer. And so that's another source. And then, once students start adding more information, we can bring in another criteria. But we keep the criteria, a number of criteria, fairly reasonable. Another thing that we can do is we can teach kids to evaluate their own writing. That's an important, probably over the long run, one of the most important sources of evaluation that's going to exist. We want them to look back, and if they set a plan, did you include the things in your plan? We may want to ask them to look for particular things like, are there, is there a way that if it's a kid who's using the same sentence structure over and over again, did you vary your sentences somewhat? It can be individual to the student, but we can teach kids also to be evaluators of their own writing and to give feedback. But both peer and self evaluation involve instruction. Now, in addition to that, we want to be sure that if we're teaching skills, strategies, knowledge, we do some assessment up front and we assess as students are learning, and we kind of have an endpoint assessment to see if they've mastered what we hope they've mastered. Now, one thing I'd like to say about this, because it gives me a chance to talk about something else, I'm going to share a strategy with you that we've used with second graders, and it's been used with older kids. It's fairly straightforward. It's for planning a story and drafting it. We ask kids before they start to write, to identify who their main characters are, where, when the story takes place, what the main character wants to do, some things that happen, and how the story ends, and maybe some reactions. Now, that's great because it gives them a structure for putting their story together. The problem is that, we could have a very successful, we could look to see if they know that kind of information up front, what they have already in their story. We can model how to do this in terms of planning and drafting, and we can work with them to do it and then slowly move to them doing it on their own and be assessing to see if those elements are in their story, right? And we get to the end point, which is our summary, and we feel great. They've mastered what we want. But the reality is that's all they ever do. If that's where they're at, they're stuck. It's like a box. That strategy gives support, and it's good support when it's appropriate. But if I get to third grade and they haven't pushed the envelope out a little bit, it's like that box is closed and they're trapped in. So our assessments need to go beyond what we do in the moment to also thinking about what we hope is going to happen in the future. So an example of this, if you took a look at somebody like Toni Morrison or Isaac Asimov, who's a famous science fiction writer who has long since passed, they were very productive storytellers. And when they were asked how they wrote a story, they were pretty consistent in what they said. They knew who the main character was. They knew what the main character wanted before they ever started writing, and they had a reasonable sense of how it was going to end, although that could be much more flexible. And then as they wrote, they produced the story. Now, they could do that because they're more master story writers than little kids. But you can see we can start taking that structure and loosening it up so that it's not saying you've got to do this, and this. It's giving more flexibility and choice as students create that structure, or we can add to that structure in various ways. So, I think it's important when we think about formative assessment and writing that it's not just the before, the during, and the after, but it's, in a sense, the beyond the after. How are we going to get students to use this flexibly and in ways that move them forward as writers? The other thing I'd like to say about summative writing is that I'm not opposed to it, but I want to focus in on a specific aspect of it. Assessments that we use, districts give each year or the state gives. And we use it in a sense to make decisions about whether teachers are effective or how qualified they are, whether students have learned what we hope they have learned. And I want to give a caution to this. In one way, if we didn't have those assessments, writing would be less in schools than it is now. I mean, I hate to say that, but the reality is we live in a situation where summative assessments are extremely important in the structure of how we think about education in the US. So if you have an assessment, then you can bet that writing is going to be taught at least somewhat. On the other hand, they've restricted the curriculum. So when I lived in Tennessee in fourth grade, they had, you could look at it as kind of a silly writing activity. I think probably kids found it as fun. But in fourth grade, you did this kind of narrative, personal narrative writing. Pretend you're a raindrop, so the raindrop falls and then your story starts. And so, it's not a bad creative kind of story thing. But guess what happened in fourth grade for writing instruction in Tennessee? That was it. That's all kids did. That was their narrative for the year. And they weren't tested in third grade, so there was a lot less going on there. So you can see that, with the summative assessment, we can get some positive things out of it because there may be more attention to writing, but then it may drift in a way that, we're not happy about over time. And the other thing I should say about this is that these are not reliable enough to make individual decisions about students or about teachers. And so, as a high stakes kind of assessment, they lack something. And in fact, when you look at this, may not be familiar to most of the audience, but there's something called Generalizability Studies, which basically says how many samples of something do I need to have a reliable measure of achievement? Well, for writing, it's not one. It's not like going to Vegas and rolling the dice once, and that tells you how things are going to go. We need multiple samples, even in the same genre. And so, usually, when we have these assessments that are done at the district level in the state, not saying that they're a bad benchmark, but we just, we want to take into account both their strengths and their weaknesses. And we don't want to go too overboard in terms of thinking these are the do all end all of high stakes assessment because they're not reliable enough and they're probably not a valid indicator of what students or teachers are doing without other assessments attached to them.
So, in starting with assessment, you starting out with formative and summative and delineating that, and I'm sure our audience is also thinking the same thing I was. I hadn't really thought of writing from a summative and formative, and I know better, but it really caught me. And you're right about doubling the amount of writing. That would certainly raise some eyebrows. So I appreciate you going further into that. But getting into what really was impactful to me was when you spoke to the feedback about when to give feedback, where to give feedback, who gives feedback, or as you highlighted, if you need to give feedback. And obviously there's places, but there's some places where you might not need to give that feedback, at least not to that detail. And I completely appreciated you delving into that a little bit deeper to help with understanding. And then recently we've been doing some work around this before, during, and after, as far as strategies go toward writing, and reading for that matter. But for you to bring that also into assessment and then add the element of beyond, that makes very clear sense about how to really look at assessment. That was a nice way to kind of summarize the end of that question to create this, like, there's a before assessment aspect, a during, and an after, but it also just has this beyond aspect to it so that we don't feel like kids are left with, okay, I've done that. And I know with my own children, I get a lot of that when I talk to them about their writing. Well, I'm done with that. We're good. I'm like, well, okay. So, so I appreciate the beyond aspect to really extend how we see the way we let kids know how they've done when they've done a writing overall.
So, one thing I would add to this related to feedback, particularly about what students write, and I'm going to share a story from about 3 years ago. I did a workshop for about 500 teachers in Texas, and they asked that it just be on giving feedback. And I had two pieces of writing that were done by the same kid, a kid with learning disabilities. And I asked teachers to break up into small groups, 2 or 3 teachers on the first one. And, there's kind of a starting exercise. What kind of feedback would they give? And it gave us a place to discuss giving feedback from, what they did versus me assuming. A little bit later on, about an hour and a half later on, I gave them, and they had a lot of great things to say. I gave them the second piece and asked them, okay, we've done some talking. What would you do now? And, they had a lot of great suggestions. But one thing stood out to me. Out of 500 teachers, only 4 connected the two pieces of writing in any way. It's almost like we're brain dead in terms of giving feedback and writing. So, it's like there's one world when we're giving feedback on this piece, it exists in a bubble by itself. And the next time kids write, at least one of the takeaways for me was this: we don't connect the two. So, think about it this way: if I give feedback in this first piece, and then the next piece, and these were both stories in this case, in the next piece, if I see that the kid did something, that I was talking about, I would like to reinforce that here. That is so good that you did that. Wow. We talked about it in your first piece. Now, I say this, I know it's hard to keep in mind everything, but there was virtually no connection. Or if I see, if I'm prompting a kid to maybe head in this direction on a first piece, and I look in the second piece and it's not changed, what does that tell me? Well, the kid needs some help if they're going to be able to do what I'm trying to get them to move towards, in this case. So let's say it's, take something like variety and sentence structures, or, using words that get your intended meaning onto page. They're going to need some instruction around that. And so that's the other thing that came up when we were talking as a group with these teachers is rarely did they provide instruction based upon the type of feedback that they were giving kids. And so, we're sometimes stunned. Oh, didn't I say this before? And then we don't see it happen. Well, it may not happen because if we're not connecting the two pieces of writing, they're not connecting them. Or if they don't have the skills to do it, they're not able to put it into play and do what we hope that they will do. And so I think those are two other important parts of thinking about formative assessment and feedback on students' writing that are not, I'm not going to say that they don't exist in schools, but they don't exist as much as maybe we'd like.
Great analogy to really extend our thinking into that, and appreciate you putting that consideration out there for us to keep in mind as we continue to work with our students around writing.
Thank you.
Dr. Graham, you're a wealth of information for our listeners and for us as we learn more about writing. We realize our time with you is short. So, as we tackle the complexities of teaching writing instruction in the classroom, what resources would you recommend to our listeners that they can connect with to learn more about teaching writing when this podcast is over?
So the first thing I would suggest is that there are 2 guides that are published by WhatWorks Clearinghouse, one at the elementary level and one at the secondary level. And those are free. They can be obtained by typing in WhatWorks Clearinghouse, and you'll see a number of guides come up. And basically, what the WhatWorks Clearinghouse guides do is they involve a very critical examination of the research literature around teaching a particular area like writing, or at the elementary age level, for example, with writing. And only the very best studies go into making the recommendations. Now, I will say with the elementary writing guide, I was the chair of that. They gave us a little bit more leeway on that. We were able to also have, which I appreciated, we were able to make some expert recommendations in there. And one of those was that kids need to write, because at the time, there wasn't enough high quality studies, even though the studies do show a positive effect, to make a strong recommendation with that. The secondary guide didn't allow us that same flexibility. But I think all of the things that you see in the guides are things that we've talked about today and they give practical examples. So I really recommend them a lot. I'd also recommend, and I feel a little uncomfortable about this because they're reports that I did for the Carnegie Corporation, but the Carnegie Corporation ask us to do three analysis for them. One is called Writing Next, and in that we take a look at kids from grade 4 to grade 12, and we looked at the available literature to see what we have evidence on that would be something we'd say, okay, this works. We have some evidence that this is an effective practice, at least in research studies. When I talked earlier about kids needing to write, supporting writing, teaching writing, those recommendations come from there and other meta-analysis that followed. We also did a report for them called Writing to Read, and that's the place where we provide the evidence, and you'll see instructional procedures in there for teaching writing, and another one that's on formative assessment called Informing Writing. So I'd recommend those three as well. In addition, I'm a big fan of the National Writing Project. In some ways, this is the largest organization on professional development that involves teachers teaching teachers that exist in the US. Their claim is that within any 80-mile or 100-mile radius, there's a National Writing Project Center. And so becoming a member of the National Writing Project Center or participating with them, I think is a great idea because what happens is you're with other teachers who love writing, and so they've been doing it for a good while. They have built up techniques. They're really great about having teachers teach teachers. I can't say enough positive things about them. In addition to that, there's a lot of stuff online that can be helpful. So, as an example, my wife, Karen Harris, developed an approach to writing instruction called self regulated strategy development. So, it's a way for teaching planning, drafting, revising, and editing strategy. It's not a whole program or anything, it's not a commercial program, but there are two companies that she only advises, no commercial connection with, that basically either provide online services, where you can take a course, that would be SRSD online. And then there's another one that provides professional development. Think SRSD. Now, I use those as examples because I really like SRSD. I've done a lot of research with my wife on it, but there are other programs like that that you can look for online. I'm going to also mention Quill. Quill is a nonprofit that is in New York City, and they've developed a sentence combining program that I think is just phenomenal. They have some grammar stuff and sentence combining, and they're working on informational writing stuff now that's not available. But sentence combining was really popular in the 1980s. They had curriculums built around it. And when whole language came along and there was very little emphasis on teaching anymore, it disappeared. And sentence combining basically involves taking smaller sentences. Teacher models how to, the dog is big, the dog is black. Teacher models how to put those together, the dog is big and black, or in some other way. And students practice doing that, and then they do it in their own writing. And the problem is teachers have to generate their own sentences, and they have to be familiar with the various sentence structures. Well, Quill has this all online, and they've done a great job of this. They kind of crowdsource. Smaller sentences might be put together, and so you might have 100,000 people put these sentences together, and then they would look and see what they thought were the three most effective in terms of human judgment. And then the program is built so that if you start in one of those directions or those three, the feedback that it gives you helps you in that sense. And so there's a lot of things that are available digitally that can be used. It's just a matter of finding those. And so that takes a little bit of work on your part, but those would be some things or some resources that I would recommend.
Thank you, Dr. Graham. This is information our listeners can take to the bank, per se. We have the literacy essential practices here in the state of Michigan, and we've been working with Dr. Nell Duke and Dr. Tanya Wright very closely on those, and Dr. Susan Lallier about research on coaching. And so when we get to Essential Six, which is research and standards aligned writing instruction, it talks specifically about sentence construction and sentence combining. And so the Quill resource is going to be a go-to for our listeners who are familiar with that. And just this week, I learned that in the state of Michigan, we have a grant that's going to allow teachers to dig into the SRSD approach and learn more about that. And so we have some local coaches and local districts that are excited about learning more about that. And there's a webinar being offered soon
Well,
for teachers to learn more about. So
I'm really glad to hear that. So that both of those sound good, and I can't speak highly enough of Quill. So I'm glad that you picked up on that.
thank you very much for sharing your information and resources with us.
You bet.
Thank you so much also for sharing those professional resources. And you brought up the National Writing Project, and we've got a lot of really strong National Writing Project, and a lot of our audience participate in that. As we're unfortunately wrapping things up here because we've gained so much and had such great conversation with all these questions that we've asked, and we appreciate the expertise again that you've offered. But as we do conclude the interview, what have we not asked that is important to highlight here?
Well, it's not that you haven't asked it. It's just that we haven't talked about it as much. And I'd like to say that, when you take a look at students and writing in school, the most important factor are students' teachers. They have a huge impact on students learning to write and their motivations to write. In my case, when I was in seventh grade, I had a social studies teacher who basically taught the class to write a report, an informational report. I don't really remember anybody else spending that much time on writing, but that stuck with me for years to come. I've used informational report writing in all aspects of my education and also in my professional life. So I think one of the most important characteristics in terms of students writing is their teachers, their own preparation, and what they bring to the classroom. Now, with that said, we often talk about the importance of teachers being writers in terms of students writing. And, how could you disagree with that? It's very important that teachers model and show their craft so that students see their role models as writers as well. On the other hand, we've done a number of studies that have taken a look at teachers' perceptions of their own writing. And let's assume for a second that when we ask teachers about their writing, that they're accurate about whether they're a strong writer or not as strong a writer. What we find is that for teachers in general, both in the US and other countries across the world, is that teachers are kind of in the middle, so to speak. Some teachers think they're pretty good writers, but most are ambivalent, and a reasonable number are pretty negative about their writing capabilities. One thing we find, though, their perceptions of how well they write do not predict what they say they do in the classroom in terms of teaching writing. Much stronger predictors are how competent they are or their self efficacy for teaching writing and their attitudes towards teaching writing. And so I think these are characteristics and beliefs we want to help teachers develop and strengthen over time because they do a really good job of predicting how well teachers put writing into play. I want to give another example of this, and that is a fifth grade teacher I saw once. And, if you were a parent and you walked into her classroom, you would see misspelled words up on the blackboard. And, I know a number of parents reacted that she didn't know how to write well based upon that. And she surely couldn't have been a good teacher. And I have to say, she's maybe one of the three best teachers I've ever seen in terms of teaching writing. So, I've also seen people who write pretty well who can't teach writing very well. So, I wouldn't get overly concerned about how well you write. And the
Sure.
final thing I'd like to talk about is vision. It's really critical that teachers have a rock solid vision of what they plan to do each year that they teach kids. I sit in on a first grade teacher's classroom once at the start of the year for a parent meeting, and somebody asked her about what she was planning on doing with reading for the next year. And she just gave this beautiful explanation of, what kinds of things kids would be reading, how they would go about the process of reading, what she would be teaching, how she would seek to motivate, their kids to really, continue to like reading because first graders always come into class liking reading for the most part. And I kind of, with some trepidation asked, well, what about writing? And she blew me away. She just like she did with reading, she had this wonderful description of what she's going to do. Plus, she said, I also this will modify. I'll make changes in this once I know my kids better. But she had a real conceptualization, really clear about what was going to happen, what her plans were, what her students were going to be doing, and she was able to convey that to parents in a simple and clear way. Now, I also have to say that was a very, very strong teacher. I had a chance to see her in operation a number of times over the years, and she was a beginning teacher, which was really impressive. I saw her a number of years later at a presentation I was doing, and I told her about my perceptions about what a great teacher she was, and her reaction was, "Oh, I'm such a better teacher now." And I thought, and I did say this. I said, "Yeah, I'm sure that's the case because she was reflective, she was planful, she was thoughtful. She was thinking about her students, she was thinking about what she did, and she thought about how she would change things." So I think a vision is absolutely critical, and I would expand that to say visions of individual teachers are important, but vision by schools are even more important. So I'll leave it at that.
I certainly can't say more than that. That's a great way to end it. And quite often we end up with tipping our hats to teachers, and that's the way it should be. I appreciate bringing up the confidence in how teachers see themselves as writers and even openness to writing and being open to that piece. And then that last part about the planning and the vision, and certainly carrying that forward and having that idea in mind is going to help with the organization, but it also helps, as you referenced earlier in our conversation, on clarity. Thanks for those extra tidbits. I just have to say I appreciate the openness and interaction and the conversation that we've had today. And I feel like I've had a bit of a professional learning opportunity for myself today and listening to the different aspects that you've brought up around writing and what that looks like and making connections to the reading. It's been an opportunity for me to certainly do some learning. So appreciate the time that you've taken with us today.
Thank you so much, Mark, and thank you guys for inviting me to talk with you today. And thank you to all the teachers who do such great work with kids.
Thank you for joining us for this LLCN brief podcast today. We appreciate our guest, Dr. Steve Graham. Thank you for sharing your insight into classroom writing instruction. If you're looking to access the resources from today's podcast episode, please visit our electronic document, LLCN 2122 resources at bit.ly/L C lowercase resources 2122.
We look forward to connecting with you again in the near future. Also, we're looking for your suggestions on topics as well as questions you may have related to literacy. Please take the time to let us know what you want to learn more about through the Google form, bit.ly/LLCN topics. That's bit.ly, bit.ly backslash capital L, capital C, capital N, all lowercase topics. Thank you for listening today.